For decades, power has obeyed a simple rule. If you have enough money, enough influence, enough history, the system slows down for you. Warnings come first, then delays, then negotiations, until suddenly none of that worked. In a federal courtroom, the most expensive shield in modern America failed in real time. No delay, no buffer, no special lane. One decision erased the illusion that bail is something you buy and keep forever. In that instant, freedom was no longer a right dressed up as paperwork. It was revealed as what it truly is, a temporary privilege granted on trust and revoked the moment that trust collapses. Most people think justice erodes gradually, quietly, behind closed doors, but sometimes systems don't erode. They snap back. What you're about to understand is not why a judge lost patience, but why the justice system reached its absolute limit. And once you see that line, you'll never look at power, privilege, or freedom the same way again. Stay with me. To understand why this moment mattered, we have to strip away the spectacle and focus on the structure beneath it. Most people believe bail is simple. You pay, you leave. You wait for trial. That belief is dangerously incomplete. Bail is not a purchase, it is not mercy, and it is certainly not a guarantee. It is a contract, one of the most fragile contracts in the justice system. The court temporarily releases control over your body, your movement, your freedom. In return, it demands compliance, restraint, and above all, respect for the authority of the process. That exchange only works if the court believes the defendant can be governed by rules instead of force. The moment behavior signals otherwise, the contract collapses. This is where power often miscalculates. Wealth creates distance from consequences. Status creates the illusion that rules are flexible. Over time, that illusion hardens into expectation. And expectations, when violated in public, create institutional crises. This wasn't a personality clash. It was a structural failure reaching visibility. And once it became visible, the system had only one option left. To see why this confrontation was inevitable, we have to zoom out. Courts were not designed for equality of outcomes. They were designed for equality of rules. But over time, something subtle changed. As wealth and political power concentrated, enforcement began to stretch. Not openly, quietly. Extra warnings here. More patience there. Small accommodations, justified as prudence, neutrality, or restraint. Each adjustment seemed reasonable in isolation. Together, they reshaped expectations. Power learned that the system hesitates. That authority negotiates. That consequences arrive slowly if they arrive at all. This is how imbalance forms, not through corruption, but through accumulated tolerance. Judges are trained to avoid the appearance of bias, especially in high-profile cases. Every decision is scrutinized, appealed, politicized. So restraint becomes habit, patience becomes policy. But restraint has a cost. When enforcement is delayed long enough, rules stop feeling binding. Compliance turns performative. Respect becomes optional. And eventually, the courtroom stops functioning as a place of law and starts resembling a stage. That is the historical tension beneath this moment. A system built on rules, facing a reality shaped by privilege, and tensions like that don't resolve gently. Every system has a moment when pressure stops being theoretical. In this case, it wasn't a crime. It wasn't flight risk. It wasn't violence. It was behavior, a laugh where silence was required, a smirk during evidence, interruptions where obedience was assumed. Individually, these moments look small. That's why they're dangerous. They test boundaries without triggering alarms. They signal something deeper than disrespect. They signal disbelief, disbelief that consequences are real. From the judge's perspective, this was the first visible crack, not in decorum, but in control. A courtroom only functions if authority is unquestioned in real time. Once that authority is mocked publicly, every person in the room is watching to see what happens next. This is where the crisis begins. Not because a rule was broken, but because a message was sent. I don't believe this applies to me. That message cannot be ignored. If it is, the court becomes theater. And when a courtroom becomes theater, justice stops being possible. This was the moment the system leaned forward and prepared to act. What looks like sudden punishment is usually the end of a long calculation. Judges are not impulsive actors. They are risk managers. Their job is not to react to emotion, but to preserve control over a fragile system. And the most fragile element in that system is trust, specifically the belief that a defendant will follow rules without force. This is where most people misunderstand bail. Bail exists to manage risk, not to reward behavior. The court is constantly asking one question: can this person be governed by instruction instead of restraint? As long as the answer is yes, freedom continues. The moment the answer becomes uncertain, freedom becomes a liability. Disrespect inside a courtroom is not about manners. It is diagnostic. It tells the court that compliance may be performative, that rules are being tested, that authority is no longer internalized. When that signal appears, the system doesn't negotiate, it corrects. This is why the response felt abrupt. It wasn't emotional escalation, it was procedural clarity. The judge wasn't reacting to arrogance. He was identifying risk and removing the safety net before it failed completely. Once that mechanism is understood, the decision stops looking extreme. It starts looking inevitable. This is the moment where tolerance runs out. By now, the signals are no longer subtle. What began as testing has become visible defiance. The room feels it, the lawyers feel it, the staff feel it. Authority is no longer assumed, it is being challenged in real time. And that changes everything. At this stage, the judge is no longer deciding how to manage one defendant. He is deciding whether the courtroom itself still functions. Because once mockery is tolerated publicly, it spreads. Jurors question seriousness. Lawyers push harder. Defendants recalibrate what they think they can get away with. The cost of inaction becomes higher than the cost of enforcement. This is where people mistake firmness for anger. But this isn't about emotion. It's about timing. The longer a system waits to correct visible defiance, the more dramatic the correction must be. So the response comes fast, public, unambiguous. Not because the moment is unique, but because it has gone on too long. What looks like escalation is actually containment. The system closes ranks, reasserts control, and draws a line that cannot be crossed without consequence. Once that line appears, there is no middle ground left. Authority is either enforced or it dissolves. Now shift your perspective. Imagine you're not powerful. No elite lawyers, no press, no patience. If you laughed during evidence, interrupted a judge, or mocked proceedings, you wouldn't receive explanations. You'd receive handcuffs immediately. That's the reality most people live with, and they know it. That's why this moment landed so hard. For once, the system didn't bend. It didn't create a special lane. It applied the same rule in real time. And for many watching, that felt shocking, but also stabilizing. Because when rules appear selective, people stop believing in them. They disengage. They grow cynical. And cynicism quietly destroys societies. This wasn't just about one defendant. It was about whether your compliance still matters when others seem exempt. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Trust in institutions doesn't recover through speeches. It recovers through visible enforcement. If this distinction matters to you between rules as theater and rules as reality, make your voice part of the conversation. Say what you think. Engage. Because when people stop paying attention, power fills the silence. Moments like this never stay contained. When authority is enforced at the very top of the hierarchy, the signal travels outward across courtrooms, boardrooms, and political systems far beyond that single case. Power studies these moments closely because they reveal where the real limits are. For years, a quiet assumption has shaped global behavior that status insulates, that pressure can be applied behind the scenes, that consequences are negotiable if you are important enough. When that assumption holds, institutions weaken everywhere, not just in one country. This moment disrupted that pattern. It reminded elites, officials, and observers that institutions still possess hard edges, that there are spaces where leverage fails, and that once those spaces disappear, systems collapse fast. Internationally, legal credibility matters. Courts are not just domestic tools, they are signals of stability. When enforcement appears selective, confidence erodes, investment hesitates, alliances strain, legitimacy weakens. What happened here sent the opposite message. Not that the system is perfect, but that it is still capable of asserting itself when pressure peaks. That matters more than most people realize. From here, the system faces three possible paths. The first is stabilization. Enforcement becomes consistent. Boundaries are clarified. Power recalibrates its expectations. This doesn't create perfection, but it restores predictability. When rules are enforced evenly, behavior adjusts. Institutions regain credibility not through force, but through reliability. The second path is partial retreat. Pressure builds. Appeals, narratives, and political backlash soften future enforcement. The line technically exists, but only on paper. The lesson learned is not compliance, but caution. Push quietly. Avoid visibility. The imbalance survives, just less openly. The third path is erosion. If enforcement is framed as illegitimate, biased, or exceptional, the message reverses. Authority becomes contested. Every ruling is questioned. Compliance becomes optional. At that point, courts don't fail dramatically. They hollow out. And hollow institutions invite instability. Which path emerges depends on what follows next. Not speeches, not opinions, but repeated behavior. Systems don't change because of one moment. They change when that moment becomes precedent. This is the deeper question now hanging in the air. Was this an exception or a reset? The answer will define not just one case, but how power behaves when it thinks no one is watching. Here is the insight most people miss. This wasn't a loss of control. It was the system reclaiming it. Courts don't survive on charisma, popularity, or power. They survive on one fragile belief that rules still matter when they are inconvenient. The moment that belief collapses, law becomes suggestion, and suggestion becomes chaos. What happened in that courtroom was a hard reminder that privilege has a boundary. Not a soft one, not a negotiable one, a hard floor. And when you hit it, there is no warning, only impact. For years, power has relied on delay, ambiguity, and tolerance. This moment stripped all three away in public view. That's why it felt shocking, and that's why it mattered. The law didn't act because it was angry. It acted because it was threatened. And when institutions feel threatened, they don't debate, they enforce. If you want to understand where real power still lives in this world, don't watch speeches. Watch moments like this where privilege fails and systems decide whether they will still function. If this analysis helped you see that line more clearly, stay here. These are the moments that reveal how societies actually hold together or come apart. And what comes next will tell us whether this was a rare exception or the beginning of a reset.